welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, one of your hosts, and today I'm here with the author of a very interesting new mystery, the second in a very engaging series. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, of course. I'm Sarah Pearse and I'm author of The Retreat and also author of The Sanatorium, which is the first book in the Ellen Warner series. So The Retreat kind of continues Ellen's story. It's very much a sort of standalone story, but without giving away any spoilers, there are kind of common threads in terms of a secondary plot line, which we see first introduced in The Sanatorium. The Retreat is set on a remote island off the South Devon coast in England, which is where I live. And it's loosely based actually on an island very close to where I live. Though I've taken some liberties with the geography. And it's very much a sort of locked room style mystery. We follow Ellen as she travels to the island, basically to investigate a bit of a curious case. A body's found on the rocks below a yoga pavilion, but she very quickly realizes that it wasn't actually a guest at the retreat, it was someone else. And we have sort of more bodies appear and Ellen's investigation gets more complex. But yeah, it's very much a continuation of Ellen's story as well as her sort of family relationships and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so much fun, and it's a really good continuation of the first story while also being a standalone, and that can be a hard thing to achieve. You know, how do you give a book its own arc while also planning a longer arc, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's a really a tricky thing. I had, when I first started writing The Sanatorium, I had very much in mind, particularly sort of 3 books within the sort of story arc that I wanted to tell. But yeah, it's quite a tricky process because I think when writing a series, both for author and reader, you want to try and keep things fresh. So I think it's very important to have that kind of central plot idea, which was the standalone. But yeah, the sort of narrative thread, I didn't want that overwhelming the new story either. So yeah, it's a lot of plotting, a lot of planning to try and get that right.
Absolutely. One thing that really interested me is sort of the settings of both books. And there's this really cool way, I think, that you take these places that used to be associated with healing or with rest or luxury and turn them into these like insidious places where dangerous things can happen. And I'm wondering, like, is that intentional? Like, is it where did your interest in these types of settings start?
Yeah, I'm really interested. First off, I suppose I would say I'm really interested in kind of places that have kind of a dark past. It's my sort of natural interest in sort of stories that I devoured when I was younger and when I'm older. I'm fascinated by the idea, particularly with the sort of luxury and, as you say, wellness and kind of places that were rest, the idea of this sort of dark side bubbling beneath them. That for me is just absolutely fascinating. And I think kind of almost when you have any kind of, with the sanatorium in particular, it was the idea of this institution. I always find institutions, be it kind of like a hospital or any environment where you've kind of got that closed setting, almost you can kind of write your own rules. And I find that kind of a fascinating thing to explore. And I think, yeah, the idea of somewhere that's kind of very luxurious and very kind of beautiful in a way, I think not just the buildings or the retreat itself, you have kind of the backdrop, this very scenic setting. And the idea that, yeah, something dark and sinister can go on in the background is something I've always been really, really drawn to. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the setting of the retreat in particular is so interesting. Like when the story was starting and you were describing the island, I was like, oh, this sounds nice. Like I would go there. And then, I quickly put that aside, when things started to happen.
I think that's a few people actually here in the UK. That's one thing my publisher has been playing with the idea. He said, it's great idea. Lots of people would want to stay. And then he said, as soon as you read, then go on and read the first 3 chapters, find out the serial killer past, the idea that it's a cursed island, maybe not so much.
Yeah, there's so many layers of its history, and it's really interesting the way that all of those different time periods that you cover kind of like come together. And I don't want to talk too much, obviously, about the end of the story, but you take a lot of different threads of like this island retreat through various periods, and they all come together in a really interesting way. Was that hard to orchestrate, or was there a lot of like how do you plot something so intricate, you know?
Yeah, it was really hard to organize. And that's actually one of the fun, I think, in writing a mystery. I kind of almost love the intellectual kind of academic exercise in kind of plotting it. But yeah, it was a lot of sort of post-it notes and lots of things kind of written out, particularly with the time frames, because without again giving too much away, it's quite hard to say, but in terms of making sure that certain characters were on the island at one period and then obviously in the island in the past, you're juggling lots and lots of time frames. So yeah, it was kind of lots of writing things down and then cross-checking once you've written through. I think yeah, there's certain elements that I had to kind of go and rewrite to make sure it works, but that's the fun of a mystery, I think, is kind of slotting all those pieces into place, so hopefully it sort of works for the reader.
Oh, absolutely. You know, like I think what's a really good mystery like this one, I think like you don't realize as you're reading, but everything is kind of getting set up like clockwork. And then like everything has to then so many things have to be in the right place for things to happen the way that they're meant to at the end, you know, like it's a very intricate structure that you have to build. It's really cool.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, it's actually, oh, thank you so much. And that's kind of what you were saying actually about the sort of luxury sort of retreat side of things. I think that plays in your favor sometimes when writing a mystery, because I think you're able to do the beautiful description without kind of perhaps the reader realizing that you're sort of pulling the plot along. And I think within a mystery, kind of every chapter and almost every scene within that chapter has to have a purpose, and you are sort of pulling the reader through the story. But yeah, if you have that beautiful description in this lovely location, you can play a lot with the description, which sort of does the hard work in sort of almost the misdirection, I think, which is really good.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about Ellen, because I think she's a really fascinating and complex protagonist. She's very strong and very competent, but she's also very vulnerable and somewhat like insecure in her abilities. And I'm wondering like what went into you crafting this character?
Yeah, it was kind of very much, it doesn't matter if you've read The Sanatorium or The Retreat, but I think just to kind of give a bit of a recap, in The Sanatorium, you meet her when she's at a career break. And that was quite important for me. I didn't want to have her kind of, most sort of mysteries do start off with a detective in role, but she was on that break and she was at a very vulnerable place, kind of both personally and emotionally. And I've tried to take her on kind of like a little bit of a journey. I think in the first book, you kind of see her very much with a crisis of confidence. And in this book, that is still there, but she's kind of back at work and kind of steeling herself a little bit for the job. Plus she has a partner that she's working alongside, that we find out. But yeah, I wanted her to be a very real character. I think lots of us carry, you know, emotions, anxiety, lots and lots of things, but aren't, I probably say, afraid to kind of reveal them. And I think Ellen as an eraser, I very much wanted her to be kind of away from the sort of norms of a detective. I think lots of female detectives often carry quite masculine or male traits, very buttoned up emotion. I wanted Ellen to be quite real. And I think a lot of us do have those emotions. And a few people have said, oh, you know, would she necessarily want to go back to being a detective if she's feeling that way? And my answer to that is absolutely yes. I think people, you know, are working in jobs, they do have those feelings, but they're just good at hiding them. And that's something I wanted to show with Ellen. I think the people around her, you know, the people she's working with might not see that side, but I think we as a reader are able to kind of almost get a glimpse into her soul, which is quite interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think she's like a really nice kind of tonic to the kind of protagonist that has dominated a lot of like mysteries and procedurals lately. Because I think we're coming out of this period where a lot of like investigators are like arrogant, confident geniuses who are terrible to everybody around them, you know, but everybody excuses their behavior because they're a genius, you know, and
yeah.
So it's really just nice to see a main character who is like quietly competent, but like humble and like kind to the people around her, you know, and it's just like a nice, refreshing type of protagonist.
Oh, thank you. No, it's really interesting you've picked up on that, because I'm the same. I have read a lot of those kind of characters where, yeah, like they are kind of a genius in some way or the other, and it's kind of, yeah, treating people around them badly, or, you know, they have sort of the drinking problem, but that's sort of brushed over because they're the genius or something like that. But yeah, I just wanted her to feel a little bit more real, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's, you know, she has a lot of really great relationships with the people around her. And that's something that I'd like to talk a little bit about too. There's a lot of very complex family and intimate relationships in this book, like both that Ellen is a part of, and also the various supporting characters who sort of make up the main players of this mystery. And do you think these types of relationships like make for like tense, interesting mysteries?
Yeah, genuinely one of the things which kind of, I have to say, I thought I'd maybe get it out of my system after 2 books, but I don't think I will. I think it's going to enter book 3. I think one of the things I'm fascinated by is how well we ever know other people, including people close to us. And I think with both the sanatorium and the retreat, you're kind of very much sort of playing with the idea of family dynamics, and that again is something I'm hugely interested in. I just think you kind of grow up with someone, you could be living in the same house or living down the street for someone, and then as you get older and kind of those bonds, physical bonds, naturally loosen. How well do you know those people around you? And I think in the retreat we're narrating from Hannah's point of view, who is, just to explain to people, she's a guest at the retreat and part of a sort of family group that are there for almost like a mini reunion. And yeah, she kind of, you very much see from the beginning, she is wondering how is this sort of vacation going to work? How is she going to sort of fit together with the sort of family members around her? And yeah, I think that sort of innate tension you have with people that are close to you, but may well have secrets bubbling in underneath, make for a really good thriller.
Yeah, because that's like another kind of interesting line that you have to walk. Like you have to make all of these characters plausible as suspects, you know, in the ongoing crime investigation, but they also need to be sympathetic, and you need to be engaged in them, you know, and that's a very difficult line to walk. And you do that very well with, I think, a lot of these characters. Like some of them are kind of surly or prickly, but you still are invested in what happens to them, you know.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things I'd sort of like to do before I'm kind of writing is really sort of delve into that backstory. And I think sort of working out those dynamics almost in my head. I don't know how other authors may do it in a slightly different way, but I kind of spend a lot of time sort of thinking about how those family bonds or friendship bonds kind of tie together. And then when you come to kind of write it, you almost know those characters quite well. So the scenes of conflict and sort of tension between them and sort of what motivates them as people, hopefully sort of then is more real on the page. But yeah, it's sort of quite a lot of thinking time in advance to sort of reach that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Hannah is a really interesting character too. I really liked her a lot. She's in this, you know, she's part of this very interesting family that has some really, really tense conflicts sort of simmering under the surface of all of their interactions. And in addition to the family relationships, you have like a number of romantic relationships too that are similarly complicated, including Ellen. You know, she has a partner who she is not her professional partner, her romantic partner, she's very invested in and is doing a lot of work in order to balance her relationship with her work, you know.
Yeah, I think kind of having those sort of relationships sort of, I don't know, at the forefront of the story is kind of, for me, what makes that kind of sort of conflict and the story real. I think you could have a sort of central plot, but unless you kind of have those sort of backstories kind of coming in, and Hannah as a person, she is very, there's sort of some similarities with Ellen. I'd say she's a very vulnerable character and she has a lot of insecurities, and again I just think she is quite real. She has these forceful sisters around her, but she is kind of sort of telling her point of view. And I think there's a sort of something I wanted to explore a little, is that idea of perhaps a simmering rage. I think with Hannah, she very much presents this kind of, you know, smiley, sort of happy-go-lucky personality in some ways, but you kind of learn very quickly and that actually her grief, without saying too much about the story, her grief and sort of what's going on beneath the surface is sort of almost barely concealed. She feels she has to come along to this holiday, she has to play a part in things, but you soon kind of find those sort of simmering almost hostilities and how she's feeling towards her relatives who might not have been, without saying too much, supportive of her as she'd like. Yeah, it's very much there, and I'm intrigued by that. I think a lot of us put those sort of faces onto the world, but what is actually beneath?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, I think maybe the reason I sympathized with her so much is because she plays a role in her family that is very familiar to me, which is, I think, is sort of like the peacekeeper among people with really strong personalities and desires and a lot of, you know, and so I see a lot of that sort of performance of like, I am the peacekeeper, I am going to try to make everybody around me happy, but also having this like, yes, this simmering resentment almost about having to play that role, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I see it quite a lot. And I think it's a role often females will play. I think you kind of very much have to almost kind of push down your own emotions in order to sort of bind a family together. I think often a mother can take that role, but interestingly, in this case, I think it's the sister. And it kind of, she comments at the very beginning, we kind of need all sort of three of us to work, but it kind of detriment to Hannah. I think Hannah's not able to be the person she wants to be. They want her to kind of be that sort of anchor, even when she's experiencing her own sort of grief and emotions. And yeah, I think that happens a lot to people.
I think so too. Let's talk a little bit about the island and its main feature, Reaper's Rock, because it's such a striking image. And I think it plays a thematic role because it kind of reminds you about like the island's dark history, but then it also becomes like a setting where really important things happen. And I'm curious about like, can you talk a little bit about how you took a real island and reimagined it for the story?
Yeah, no, definitely. There's actually an island. Yeah, it's kind of almost 5 minutes sort of away geographically, but then it's obviously set out to sea. And it's somewhere that's always fascinated me and people in our local area. It actually has a rocky outcrop on it, which people kind of have described as a thatcher. It's called Thatcher Rock, so someone who kind of thatches a roof. And I just kind of, it almost very much looks like a person from certain angles. It kind of very much captured my imagination. And I started kind of researching sort of natural landmarks and natural land formations. And we have something here called Stonehenge as well, which you've probably heard of. Very, very famous. And kind of people attach a lot of significance to kind of those natural kind of in the topography. And I just, it really captured my imagination. I thought, could this be sort of seen as a totem for something? And I think it's something we have done over the years. I think in history, we attach a lot of sort of significance to landmarks and a lot of superstition. And I think it becomes very much a kind of, a totem for how people are feeling, not just about the island, but about its past, about their own fears and their own kind of things. I think Ellen very much sort of interprets it in one way. I think Hannah sees it in another way. Is it just a rock or is it something else? Yeah.
Yeah, because as you're talking, I'm thinking that like the island itself and the project of building this retreat almost mirrors like a lot of the emotional dynamics, right? Because it has this like dark sort of like insidious past that they're trying to like paper over with this like new image of like wellness and rest and like get away from your life and like recover here, you know, like a lot of like repression of history that sort of like all kind of bubbles up at inopportune moments, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And that is again something when I was writing the sanatorium as well, I'm really intrigued by. I think one of the things people often say is that we never learn from history, kind of each new generation that comes along. And I'm just fascinated by the idea that you can have all this new, like you say, kind of from the architect's point of view, without giving too much away, he has his own agenda of why he wants the retreat to be built on the island. But yeah, you have this very sort of modern facade, but the past is always there and it's something you can't suppress. And I think you see that within the characters as well. However hard the sisters or the family group try to suppress the secrets, they're kind of bubbling to the surface as the story goes on.
Yes. So when you started this series, or maybe this particular book, you know, I'm always very interested in the inception point for a book for authors. Like, did it start with an image or a line of dialogue or an idea about a character? Like, what was your entry point?
Yeah, so for the retreat, it was very much the island. And it's a bit similar to the sanatorium in terms of sort of a location I know well. I'd lived in Switzerland, so for the sanatorium, I'd very much wanted to set a book in the mountains. But here in the UK, this island and kind of my local area, it's just somewhere I sort of am very sort of attached to. So I knew I always wanted to set a novel there. And obviously Ellen, we see in the first book, she sort of traveled, she's on a career break, but her local force is this kind of police force here in Devon. So yeah, it was very much the island as the initial sort of image, and the idea of this sort of retreat, and sort of also this past around sort of locals having sort of question marks over whether something should be built on the island. That's very topical in my area. We have kind of lots of question marks over planning and whether things should sort of be built. But it was very much the rock as the initial image.
Oh, very neat. Yeah, it's really striking. And I think that it just sets the mood for the whole book very well.
Oh, thank you.
When you were imagining the island, like a lot of the like physical layout, like where various buildings are, is very important, and how long it takes to get from one place to another, and like how various parts of the island are connected. Like, did you like map the island in any way, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think at the beginning, even though you can have like a very clear image in your head, I did with the sanatorium, with the hotel in that book as well. But you have, there were kind of question marks, exactly as you say, is it plausible someone might land here on a boat, walk across the beach that quickly? So yeah, I kind of very loosely sketched the sort of entry points of the island, and then also working out, because in the island you have the hotel and you have the retreat, but you also have a large part of the island which is quite wild. So yeah, I kind of needed to know how that worked. But yeah, I kind of have everything sort of set on one plateau, which helped. But yeah, I think you also always need to do a little sketch to see if it works.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into writing a book. I think a lot of people think that it's just sitting down at your computer and putting words on the page, but there's a lot of like conceptual stuff that has to happen first before you get to that point.
Yeah, definitely. And how I like, and probably it's kind of influenced from sort of thrillers I like, because the sort of setting plays quite a big role. Like you were saying, the conceptualizing, I think you really, really need to sort of have that world, almost like world building. I know that's used in fantasy more, but for me, that kind of idea of a place and a setting so real that the reader feels like they could kind of walk around it. I think I have to get to know that detail first. So yeah, it can kind of take quite a few weeks for you to get to know that landscape. And then also kind of when you're sort of drafting, going back through and making sure everything works. Don't get me wrong, my editor still pulled me off on a few on a few elements, but yeah, you have to know it absolutely before you can write it, I think.
Yeah. So what is your do you outline first, or do you just start writing when you know, when you're down to like after you've done the conceptual stuff? Like how do you plot your story out first, or?
Yeah, definitely. I think I started off writing short fiction where I very much didn't. It was kind of very much capturing sort of an idea or an emotion. But I think with writing a thriller, you really need to sort of know where that story is going. So don't get me wrong, there were kind of certain scenes or chapters I had where I kind of wrote furiously because that was something that came to mind, particularly around the rock. I very much had that initial scene of them arriving on the boat and viewing the island for the first time. And that's something I think I probably wrote before editing. But yeah, I kind of very much know where I'm going. And also sort of I divide the book in very much into sections. Kind of I have that midway point and kind of work up to that and then work away from that point towards the ending. So yeah, I kind of don't outline. I know some authors sort of do chapter by chapter. But yeah, I sort of start off with loosely knowing almost like which plot points I have to hit and then go from there. And then sort of chapter by chapter as I'm working, I'll plan those.
And I think that comes through because the book is really well paced as well. And I think it does have like a very good, like it keeps you reading with like these sort of like really short, like action filled chapters, you know, just like, because when I was reading it, I was like, okay, next chapter, I'm going to stop and I'm going to go to bed. Like, oh, well, that was really fast. Like, I'm going to do one more. Okay, one more, you know, like, and it's just.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. Thank you.
So could I ask you what is next for Ellen Warner?
Yeah, so without giving too much away about the sort of second book, which obviously is the retreat that we're talking about, the third book is going to be a continuation of the story, another standalone mystery. But yeah, we're going to find out more, very much more, and perhaps come to a conclusion about the sort of secondary plot thread that's running through the story in book 2 in the retreat.
That's great. Yeah, I'm very invested in her story now and in her relationship with both of her partners, her romantic one and her professional one. We didn't talk very much about him, and I really like him too. Can you talk a little bit about where he came from?
Is this Will or Steed? Sorry, is this
Steed? Sorry.
Yeah, no, Steed. He's someone I very much wanted to kind of have Ellen with a partner this time and sort of someone to bounce off. I think very much because she is quite an intense character. I think within the sanatorium, she's very much working alone. And I think that sort of works well, obviously, given the setting. But I think seeing her with Steed and seeing how they work together, for me, that was a really sort of interesting dynamic. I think we kind of see more of her character, how she can work potentially in the future, perhaps with other people as well. And yeah, I think he was quite a good foil to her. I think we needed that in the investigation. I think particularly because she is kind of coming back into this sort of first big case back in the UK. I think the dynamic between them sort of, yeah, was needed. I think her on her own could have made for quite an intense book and also perhaps some questionable decisions. So yeah, I think it works well.
Yeah, I totally agree. He's a really grounding presence for her, you know, and outside of him, she has a lot of like very tense and, borderline hostile relationships with the people who she's working on the case with. And she has a lot of like tensions with her romantic partner too. And Steed was just like a nice sort of calming presence for her, I think. And
I think it was interesting seeing her kind of work with someone that's just quite neutral. I think she doesn't have that history. She doesn't have the sort of backstory with him. And I think that's quite interesting for the sort of reader to see the character kind of seeing her bounce off someone that she doesn't have that tension or conflict with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a very silly question to wrap up with, but Steed isn't named after Steve from the Avengers, is he?
I love that question though. No, he's not.
Because he's who I thought of at first, and then as I read, I'm like, oh, he's like a little cooler and younger than Steve. So.
Oh, I love that. No, he's not. His own Steve, but he could be.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with me and our listeners. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no, of course. And if anyone has any sort of questions or anything, welcome to sort of contact me on Instagram or anything. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, listeners. So please check out The Retreat, the second Detective Ellen Warner book, available at a library or independent bookstore near you on July 19th. I'd like to thank you for listening. This has been Jenn in conversation with Sarah Pearse, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.